The silence after victory, the fire had already done its work. The smoke still clung to the stones, sinking into the skin, into memory. By the time the shouting stopped, there was nothing left to beg for. The men were gone. The children were gone. What remained were women standing barefoot on cold stone, ordered into lines so straight they felt carved rather than formed. No ropes, no guards gripping arms. Just space, silence, and the knowledge that escape was no longer part of the world. The courtyard was enclosed on all sides by stone walls that rose without decoration. No banners, no carvings, nothing that spoke of pride or mercy. Sparta did not decorate its power. It did not need to. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if even sound had learned caution here. 31 women stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed forward, their hands empty. The absence of chains felt deliberate, as if restraint itself would have been excessive. A man approached from the far end of the courtyard. He wore a crimson cloak, faded at the edges but unmistakable. He did not hurry. He did not look at any one woman for too long. His authority did not come from force, but from certainty. When he stopped, he spoke without raising his voice. "You are no longer Athenians," he said. "You are no longer wives." Each sentence landed cleanly, without emotion. There was no insult in his tone, no anger, only finality. He did not describe what would happen next. He did not need to. In Sparta, explanation was not part of the process. Names were stripped away as efficiently as clothing once had been. Identity was removed first. Everything else would follow. One woman, Melina, stood near the center of the line. She did not move. She had already learned that movement attracted attention, and attention in Sparta was never a gift. 3 days earlier, she had been a wife, a mother, a keeper of routine and small domestic certainties. Now those words felt distant, almost fictional, like stories told about someone else. The man continued speaking, not to them, but past them, as if addressing the city itself. He spoke of allocation, of needs, of balance. The language was administrative, stripped of cruelty by precision. It was worse that way. Violence could be understood. Systems could not. Systems moved forward regardless of tears. "You belong to the state," he said. "Not as slaves." That pause mattered. Slaves worked. Slaves served visibly. What he implied was something else entirely. He turned and walked away, without waiting for acknowledgement. The silence that followed was heavier than the fire had been. Then Spartan women stepped forward. They wore plain garments, their hair bound tightly back. Their faces held no judgment, no sympathy, only purpose. With brief gestures, they separated the group into smaller units, counting quietly, efficiently. 8 women here, 8 there. Melina found herself guided toward a narrow doorway cut into stone. Inside, the air was cool. The room was bare. A stone table, a vessel of water, a wax tablet. An older woman stood waiting, her posture rigid from years of repetition. She did not ask Melina to speak. She simply began. Questions followed. Not personal ones, not emotional ones. They were technical. Age, health, cycles. Background reduced to categories that could be marked, stored, forgotten. Each answer was recorded with a small incision in wax. Melina understood without being told that this was not interrogation. It was inventory. When it ended, she was led into a shared room where other women sat in silence. No one spoke. Silence became agreement, protection, resistance in its smallest form. That night, food was delivered. Enough, no more. Even nourishment followed rules. Lying awake on a hard bed, Melina understood something essential. This place did not rely on cruelty. It relied on inevitability. Every step had been decided long before she arrived. Sparta did not rage. It processed at dawn. They were taken again, one by one, back into identical rooms. More questions. More marks. No explanation. When Melina left the room, she sensed something had shifted. She had not been condemned. She had been classified. As she crossed the courtyard once more, she felt it clearly now. She had passed an invisible boundary, not into chaos, but into a system that already knew exactly what to do with her. And whatever came next had been waiting for her long before the war ever began. When a woman becomes a resource by the third morning, Melina no longer measured time by sleep. She measured it by footsteps in the corridor. The sound never varied. The same pace. The same pause at each doorway. Sparta did not rush its processes. Urgency implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had been trained out of this city long ago. She was led through corridors that seemed deliberately confusing, turning just often enough to erase any sense of direction. The walls were bare stone, worn smooth by generations of passage. These were not prisons built to intimidate. They were spaces designed to normalize confinement, to make enclosure feel like the natural order of things. This time, the room was larger. Light entered from above through a narrow opening, cutting a pale line across the floor. Several Spartan women waited inside, younger than the first, their bodies strong, controlled, shaped by discipline rather than softness. They did not look at Melina as an enemy. They looked at her the way one looks at grain before storage. With evaluation. She was instructed to stand still. Hands measured her arms, her shoulders, her hips. Fingers pressed against skin, checking for injury, weakness, anything that might reduce usefulness. No one spoke while this happened. Speech was unnecessary. The body was answering the questions on its own. Melina felt something tighten inside her chest. Not panic, not yet. It was the slow understanding that whatever she represented to Sparta now had nothing to do with who she had been. Memory held no value here. Only function. She was guided to a bench and told to drink water. The instruction was calm, almost considerate. That was what unsettled her most. Sparta did not need to break her. It needed to preserve her. Across the room, another woman was being examined. She was younger, her hands shaking despite her efforts to control them. A Spartan woman corrected her posture with a brief touch, firm but not violent. Even fear, Melina realized, was being managed. Excess emotion disrupted efficiency. Wax tablets were passed from hand to hand. Symbols were added, removed, adjusted. Melina could not read them, but she understood their purpose. These markings would determine where she slept, how she worked, how long she would be kept alive. When it was finished, she was led outside again. This time not to the shared room, but to a different courtyard, smaller, enclosed more tightly. The buildings here had no windows at ground level. The air smelled faintly of oil and clean stone. Other women were already there. Some sat, some stood. All waited. Hours passed without explanation. No food, no water. Just waiting. Melina felt the tension settle into her muscles, the same way she had once felt before childbirth. Anticipation without clarity. The body preparing for something unnamed. Finally, an older Spartan man entered the courtyard, accompanied by 2 guards. He did not look at the women directly. His attention remained fixed on the tablets he carried. Names were called, not spoken aloud, but indicated by gesture. Women were selected one by one and led away through separate doorways. Each departure deepened the silence. Melina noticed something then, something small but impossible to ignore. None of the women taken resisted. They stood when indicated. They followed. Whatever they feared, it was quieter than the certainty of disobedience. When Melina's turn came, she rose immediately. The room she was brought into was not harsh. It was almost clean. A low bed, a basin, fresh water. The absence of restraints was deliberate. This was not a place for force. It was a place for compliance. A Spartan woman entered and spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, trained, stripped of unnecessary warmth. "You will be assigned," she said. "You will be instructed. You will be expected to cooperate." Melina asked one question, the first since arriving in Sparta. "For how long?" The woman did not answer directly. "For as long as you are useful." That was the rule beneath every other rule. Sparta did not deal in vengeance. It dealt in maintenance. Women like Melina were not punished for belonging to the enemy. They were absorbed, redistributed, repurposed into the structure that sustained the city. That night, Melina lay awake again, but this time her thoughts sharpened instead of scattering. She began to see the pattern forming around her. Sparta was not improvising her fate. It was following a script refined over generations, one that turned human lives into manageable units. And somewhere within that script, there was a role she had not yet been shown. From the corridor beyond her door, she heard muffled sounds. Not screams. Something quieter, controlled. Human voices learning too late what they had been assigned to become. Melina closed her eyes, knowing the next instruction would come soon. And when it did, there would be no choice left to make. The ritual Sparta never wrote down the instruction did not come with ceremony. It never did. In Sparta, importance was signaled by silence, not announcement. When the door opened before dawn, Melina was already awake, sitting upright on the bed as if her body had learned to anticipate command before sound arrived. She was told to wash. The water was cold, deliberately so. It sharpened the senses, stripped away the fog of fatigue. Cleanliness here was not about dignity. It was about preparation. When she finished, a plain garment was placed in her hands. Undyed, unmarked, it erased distinction. Once worn, it made every woman interchangeable. They walked through corridors Melina had not seen before, deeper into the complex, where the stone seemed older, heavier. Torches burned along the walls, their flames steady, controlled, producing more shadow than light. The silence here felt intentional, preserved, as if sound itself had once been forbidden and never fully returned. They stopped before a doorway narrower than the others dot inside. The room was circular. No furniture, just stone walls and a shallow basin set into the floor. The air was warm, almost humid. Melina sensed immediately that this place served a purpose that was not spoken aloud. Other women were already there, standing at measured distances from one another. No one made eye contact. That was another rule learned without instruction. Eye contact invited recognition, and recognition invited memory. Memory had no function here. A Spartan woman entered, older than most Melina had seen. Her hair was streaked with gray, her posture rigid with authority earned through repetition rather than rank. She did not introduce herself. Names were irrelevant. "This is not a punishment," she said. The statement felt rehearsed, repeated across years, perhaps centuries. "This is a duty." No one asked what kind. The ritual unfolded without explanation. The women were guided, positioned, instructed through gesture rather than speech. The process was careful, methodical, stripped of spectacle. There were no prayers spoken aloud, no invocations of gods. That absence struck Melina deeply. Whatever this was, it was not meant for divine witness. It was meant to work. She understood then why no laws described it, why no Spartan boasted of it. This was not glory. It was maintenance. A mechanism designed to serve the city quietly, efficiently, without attracting attention or reflection. The men who entered later did so without ceremony. They were not armored. They carried no weapons. Their faces were blank, disciplined, trained to sever thought from action. They did not look like conquerors. They looked like functionaries. Melina felt fear rise, but it had nowhere to go. Screaming would have been useless. Resistance would have been noted, corrected, and recorded. The ritual did not require consent, but it also did not provoke rebellion. It relied on inevitability. She realized then why Sparta never wrote this down. Writing fixed things. Writing invited interpretation, debate, doubt. This ritual survived precisely because it was never named. It passed from generation to generation through instruction, through practice, through silence. It existed in the spaces between laws. When it was over, there was no acknowledgement, no conclusion. The men left first. The Spartan women remained, guiding the captives back to their rooms with the same calm efficiency as before. Melina felt detached from her body, as if she were observing herself from a distance. Not broken, not hysterical. Something else had been taken, something quieter. The certainty that there were lines that could not be crossed. In the days that followed, no one spoke of what had occurred. But it shaped everything. The way food was rationed, the way rooms were assigned, the way certain women were moved more frequently than others. Patterns emerged for those who watched closely. This was the true horror. Not the act itself, but the structure around it. A system that required no cruelty from individuals, because cruelty had been absorbed into procedure. At night, whispers spread between the women. Fragments of understanding passed carefully, always incomplete. Some spoke of repetition, others of assignment to specific households, others still of women who were never seen again. No one knew the full design. And that uncertainty was intentional. Melina began to understand that Sparta did not rely on terror alone. It relied on ambiguity. Each woman imagined her own future, and that private imagining proved more effective than any threat spoken aloud. She also understood something else. This ritual was not about humiliation. It was about control of outcomes, control of bloodlines, control of bodies as vessels rather than lives. Sparta feared chaos above all else. And chaos, it believed, entered the world through unpredictability, through desire, through unchecked lineage. This ritual reduced all of that to calculation. As Melina lay awake once more, she felt the weight of history pressing in from the stone walls. This was not new. This had happened before, many times, to many women whose names never survived. And still, Sparta endured, which meant this ritual had worked. But what it had cost the city to preserve itself remained buried, unspoken, waiting for someone in the future to finally name it. And when that name emerged, it would change how history judged Sparta forever. Why Sparta needed this cruel system. To understand why Sparta built such a system, one has to step far beyond Melina and her suffering. Long before she stood in that stone chamber, long before her city burned, Sparta had already decided what kind of place it would become. Not through a single law or ruler, but through fear accumulated over generations. Sparta did not begin as a land of stone and discipline. It began as a conquest. Fertile valleys were taken by force, and the people who once owned them were not destroyed. They were kept, made to work, made to remember. These subjugated populations outnumbered their conquerors many times over. From the beginning, Sparta lived with the constant knowledge that rebellion was always possible. That fear reshaped everything. Where other cities relied on walls, Sparta relied on control. Where others used law and debate, Sparta used conditioning. From childhood, Spartans were trained not just to fight, but to suppress hesitation. Doubt was treated as weakness, emotion as disorder. The individual was never meant to stand apart from the city. Over time, This mentality extended beyond soldiers and into every body the city controlled. Women in Sparta were already different from those elsewhere in Greece. They trained physically. They spoke openly. But that freedom existed for a reason. Strong women produced strong children, and children were the future of the state. Everything came back to survival. When war brought foreign women into Sparta's grasp, they were not seen as enemies to be destroyed. They were variables to be managed. Left uncontrolled, they represented disorder, grief, anger, memory of lost husbands. All dangerous things. So Sparta absorbed them. This was not an act of cruelty born from rage. It was born from calculation. A city that lived under constant threat learned to remove unpredictability wherever it could find it. Bodies became systems. Reproduction became policy. Suffering became an acceptable byproduct of stability. The ritual Melina endured was one piece of a much larger structure. It did not exist in isolation. It was connected to land ownership, citizenship, inheritance, and military obligation. Every Spartan male was required to serve. Every Spartan household was expected to contribute to the state's endurance. Foreign women were slotted into this machinery where they could serve a function without disrupting the hierarchy. Sparta could not afford compassion that weakened control. This is why the system was silent, why it left no written trace. Laws invite interpretation. Interpretation invites debate. Debate invites fracture. So instead, practice replaced policy. What was done often enough became tradition. What became tradition no longer needed justification. Over generations, the ritual hardened into something unquestioned. Spartans born into the system never experienced an alternative. They did not see cruelty. They saw order. They saw necessity. The men who participated were not sadists. They were trained products of a society that separated feeling from action. To them, obedience was virtue. Reflection was danger. And so, what happened to women like Melina was not considered punishment. It was considered balance. This explains why Sparta fascinated and horrified other Greek cities. Outsiders saw discipline without excess, unity without debate. They admired the results while misunderstanding the cost. Even ancient writers struggled to describe Sparta honestly. Some praised it. Others hinted at darkness without fully naming it. The truth sat uncomfortably between admiration and fear. Sparta survived longer than many of its rivals. But survival came with a price. A city that eliminates doubt also eliminates mercy. A system that values stability above all else eventually begins to consume the very people it was built to protect. Melina sensed this long before she understood it intellectually. She felt it in the way Spartan women moved with efficiency but little warmth. In the way children were separated early from mothers. In the way no one asked questions whose answers might disturb the structure. Sparta did not need monsters. It created obedience, and obedience, once perfected, did far more damage than rage ever could. As the days passed, Melina realized that her suffering was not accidental. It was necessary within this system. The cruelty was not a flaw. It was a feature, carefully controlled, carefully hidden, carefully justified. But no system built on fear remains stable forever. Somewhere in the quiet machinery of Sparta, cracks had already begun to form. Contradictions, silences, stories that did not align. And it would be those cracks, centuries later, that historians would finally begin to notice. When they did, the image of Sparta as a flawless engine of discipline would begin to collapse, and what emerged from the ruins would be far darker than the myths ever admitted. The secret historians almost missed for centuries. The story of Sparta was told through admiration and fear, but rarely through scrutiny. Ancient writers circled around its practices, describing discipline, endurance, and unity, while leaving careful gaps where uncomfortable questions should have been. Those gaps became tradition. Tradition became myth. And myth, repeated often enough, hardened into accepted truth. It was only much later that historians began to notice something wrong with the silence. The record spoke in numbers, but not in names. Lists of households expanded without explanation. Mentions of women appeared briefly and then vanished from the narrative. There were references to population management, to inheritance irregularities, to children raised without clear maternal lineage. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that did not fit the heroic image Sparta projected. What was missing mattered more than what survived. Archaeological remains offered the first quiet challenge. Living quarters arranged not for families, but for rotation. Communal spaces that suggested movement rather than settlement. Burial practices that excluded certain women entirely, as if their existence had been temporary, conditional. Still, no document described the ritual directly. No law named it. No decree defended it. That absence was once seen as proof it never existed. But silence, historians slowly realized, could also be evidence of intent. Sparta did not write down what it did not want remembered. Fragments from outsiders proved more revealing than Spartan sources themselves. Passing remarks, awkward metaphors, complaints disguised as praise. A few ancient observers hinted that Spartan order required practices too severe to describe openly. They did not elaborate. Perhaps they feared disbelief. Perhaps they feared understanding too well. Modern scholars began rereading these sources not for what they declared, but for what they avoided. Why were defeated women discussed as settled rather than enslaved? Why were certain births celebrated without mention of mothers? Why did Spartan women speak of strength, while foreign women disappeared? The answers did not arrive all at once. They emerged slowly, reluctantly, through comparison and contradiction. A system became visible only when viewed from its edges. What historians uncovered was not a single horrific event, but a method, a way of absorbing conquered populations without allowing them to destabilize the city, a way of turning loss into resource, trauma into structure. The ritual was never meant to be remembered, because it was never meant to be questioned. Sparta survived by ensuring that those who suffered did so invisibly. Their pain left no official trace, no monument, no inscription, only bodies that passed through the city and were either reassigned or erased from record. This realization forced historians to confront an uncomfortable truth. The absence of evidence was not innocence. It was design. Sparta's reputation for discipline had blinded generations to the cost of that discipline. The city did not collapse under invasion alone. It collapsed under its own rigidity. A system that eliminated flexibility eventually eliminated itself. As scholars pieced together this hidden structure, the myth of Sparta began to fracture. What emerged was not a city of perfect warriors, but a city terrified of disorder, willing to sacrifice humanity to preserve control. And Melina's story, once unimaginable, became plausible. She was no anomaly. She was one of many. Her experience fit too neatly into the gaps history had left behind. The classification, the reassignment, the disappearance from narrative. These women did not fail to leave records. Records failed to include them. That realization changed how Sparta was taught, discussed, and remembered. Not as a model to admire blindly, but as a warning about what happens when survival becomes the only moral measure. Yet even now, the full truth remains uncomfortable. To accept it is to accept that order can be more dangerous than chaos. That systems built without compassion do not merely oppress enemies. They consume everyone within reach, the secret historians. Uncovered was not just about Sparta. It was about how easily cruelty can hide behind structure. And how long it can survive. When no one dares to name it, What this reveals about humanity by the time Sparta faded from power. The system that sustained it had already done its damage. The city did not fall in a single moment of collapse. It thinned. It hardened. It turned inward. The same discipline that once preserved it slowly erased its ability to adapt, to feel, to change. What remained were ruins and stories. And for a long time, those stories were told carefully, favoring strength over suffering. Melina's name does not appear in any record. Neither do the names of the women who stood beside her in that courtyard. History often measures survival in victories and monuments, not in lives quietly absorbed and forgotten. But absence speaks, and when listened to closely, it tells a darker truth. Sparta believed it had mastered cruelty by removing emotion from it. By turning violence into procedure, it thought it had made suffering manageable, almost invisible. There were no outbursts, no excess, no chaos. Everything happened within rules, but cruelty does not vanish when it becomes orderly. It deepens. The ritual that governed women like Melina reveals something unsettling about human nature. We are capable of extraordinary harm, not only when driven by hatred, but when driven by efficiency. When suffering is justified as necessary. When people become resources, and compassion is labeled weakness. Sparta did not invent this instinct. It refined it. The city's greatest illusion was believing that control could replace morality, that obedience could stand in for conscience, that a system could be so perfectly designed that no one within it needed to think. History shows us the cost of that belief. The men who enforced Sparta's will were not monsters in the way stories often imagine. They were trained to act without reflection. They learned that doubt was dangerous. That feeling slowed action. In doing so, they surrendered responsibility to the system itself. And systems do not feel guilt. This is why the story of Sparta endures. Not because of its victories, but because of its warning. When societies prioritize survival above all else, they begin to excuse what would otherwise be unthinkable. They stop asking who suffers and focus only on what functions. The women who passed through Sparta's hidden machinery remind us of the human cost behind abstract ideals. They were not symbols. They were people with memories, attachments, fears, and hopes that had no place in a city that valued endurance over empathy. Melina's quiet decision to protect her mind, even when her body was controlled, was an act of resistance no system could fully eliminate. It was small, fragile, but it mattered. Because it preserved something Sparta could not classify. History is filled with cities like Sparta. Different names, different rituals, the same logic. When order becomes sacred, people become expendable. The ruins of Sparta still stand, silent and enduring, much like the city intended to be. But stone remembers differently than people do. It preserves shape, not meaning. It takes voices to restore what was erased, and those voices, when they finally speak, force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization does not progress in a straight line toward justice. It advances and retreats, often preserving itself through methods it later pretends never existed. Sparta wanted to be eternal. In trying to achieve that, it revealed something timeless instead, that the greatest danger to humanity is not chaos, but the belief that order justifies everything. The story of Melina ends where history often begins to look away. No resolution, no redemption offered by the city that consumed her. Only survival within a structure that denied her significance. Yet, in telling her story now, in naming what was once hidden, something shifts. What was designed to be forgotten becomes remembered. And in that act of remembrance, the system that tried to erase her finally loses its power.